In this video, I'm going to talk about coolant pipes and hoses, how to replace them, which is a pretty simple process for the most part because Porsche have done a really nice job of making this stuff really accessible, and it's easy to pull the stuff out and replace it without too much of a hassle. There are a couple of things in here which are a bit of a nightmare, and I'll go through all of that, but for the most part, it's pretty simple. I'm not going to talk about anything back to the transmission. Have a look at the video that I made on the PDK cooling system if you need to replace hoses back there. And at the front, I'm not actually going to remove some of the hard pipes because it requires dropping of the subframe, but I'll explain to you exactly what needs to be done. But for the most part, I'll pull everything apart and I'll show you how everything gets put back together again. In the description below, there's going to be links to a bunch of stuff like how to drain and fill and bleed the coolant, as well as a bunch of other stuff. So have a look at that because depending on the job that you're doing, you'll need access to that information as well. A couple of generic things before we go on to the specifics. There are a lot of connections like this with these rubber hoses, and they're all the same. So I'll just show you once, showing each of them. There's a spring-loaded clamp on this end. There are special tools for this. I actually find a pair of multi-grips works probably even better. And what I've done is I've just ground a couple of little notches in there so it grips these really easily. And all you do is just compress that like that and then just rotate off to the side. Then I just use a plastic trim removal tool. I just jam that in there and then just rotate that around to separate it from the pipe because it's all going to be stuck. And then give that a bit of a wiggle and that'll just pop straight off. And for these connections point here, there's going to be this metal clip that holds everything in place. I find it's easy, instead of just pulling that out, because it's supposed to sort of just sit there, I find it's easier just to pull those things off completely. Just notice the orientation of the way that goes on prior to removing it. And then what I find is there's a little lip in the metal there, which is part of the hose. I'm going to jam a screwdriver up in there. And don't just rotate that because it'll bend that little lip. What you want to do is be wiggling that as you just gently rotate the screwdriver, and eventually it'll just pop out like that. And what you have is the O-ring there, which does the sealing on the inside. Prior to installation, this needs to go back on again. And then what we're going to do is grease up the inside here, and then we just press it straight on, making sure that O-ring doesn't get deformed. And when you push that in, you want to hear it click in place on both sides. Then just give a pull to make sure that everything is nice and secure. And then this one here, obviously, we're just going to put that on, compress the spring. And once that spring is compressed, then we can move that back and just put it between the two lines there on the hose, and then release it. And then everything is good to go. There are lots of connection points here with screws, mainly M6. So if they're M6, they're going to be 13 Newton meters. There's the odd one that's M8, which is going to be 33 Newton meters. And the only one that's a little bit different is this one up in here, which is a coarse T30 Torx screw, and that takes 10 Newton meters. So the first thing I'm going to do is just remove these two large pipes here, exactly the same as I showed before. When you're removing these connections up the front here, it's actually easiest just to remove this whole bracket. You can remove the plastic bracket that holds onto it, but it's actually easiest to remove the whole thing. And the way that works is there are two screws that go up in here, and they clip around the main coolant pipes. There's one here which clicks onto a bleeder line, but the two big screws here, they take 65 Newton meters on install, so you just pull that out and then you just get a whole bunch more room. This rubber pipe here just has two of those spring connectors. Remove those and then disconnect from there and there. To remove this hard pipe here, single T30 connection here, that screw just comes straight out, 10 Newton meters on install, and this one up here, which is an M6, 13 Newton meters on install. Once that comes out, this thing just pulls out sideways. Of note, all of the E10 connection's an 8mm standard socket, and it's going to be skinnier. Fits on all of those perfectly well, so oftentimes I use that instead of the E10 because some of the spots here it's a little bit tight for space. And then just pulls out this way out of that hole there. Now, of note, I have already removed all of these multiple times, so everything's pretty loose. They're going to be pretty stuck in there. This one here's got 2 O-rings. Again, replace those, grease everything up, and then just slot that into place. This hard pipe here, which goes up to the bottom of the block out of the pump, there's a molded seal on the inside of there, and also I've heard of this little connection here, which is one of the drain points, where this can crack and leak. This pipe that I pulled out before doesn't have to come out. This can just come out all by itself. And that's what that pipe looks like with the 2 molded seals in there. This up in here is the thermostat housing. It's where all the coolant comes back to prior to coming out of this black pipe here, which goes to the back of the pump and then pumps to the engine. The feeds to it are from the engine by that pipe that metal pipe that we pulled out before, by this one, which is the big fat pipe that comes from the radiators at the front. You've got the heater core return, as well as this one back here, which comes from the transmission coolers. Removal of this whole thing is really not such a big deal. First thing you want to do is disconnect the electrical connector, which is up in here. It's really hard to get your fingers on that, so what you'll need to do is remove the cover. There's a metal cover that sits over the top. There are 2 screws in here that you'll need to remove. Both are E10. And then it comes off, and then you can disconnect the electrical connector. If you want some more detail on that, have a look at the thermostat video that I did. That's the cover there. There's still a 3rd screw up there which holds the thermostat in place. Those other 2 there that I've just pulled off also hold it in place. Also be careful when you're pulling off all these screws. Whilst they look really similar, they're all slightly different lengths. So the 3 on this one are 20 mils long, some of these are 25, some are 35, so make sure you don't get those mixed up. So once that is off, then I can disconnect the electrical connector off that, which is that one up there. We've got the connection from the heater core return. This has got one of those spring-loaded clips which I've already disconnected. You can pull off that hose, just put that to the side. Also, I would suggest up here is the earthing cable. I'm just going to get that out of the way. The connection point here is the one that holds it to the bottom of the head. And then there are the 3 connection points here. There's a molded seal inside this black plastic pipe, which is the one that feeds to the pump. And from what I've seen, this is where you can sometimes get leaks. And now with those points all disconnected, all we can do is, it's still connected by some O-rings in this spot here. So this thing can rotate like that. So I'm going to rotate it up and away from this pipe here. So like that. And if I wiggle that, this is actually slightly loose. That allows me to then just pull that forward. And that's it. There, so there's the connection from the heater core. There's the remaining screw for the thermostat. And that there is where that came out of there. And that is the one that connects to the back of the black pipe there. And there is the molded seal in the back of that black pipe that can be replaced if required. If you need to remove the pump, have a look at the pump removal video that I made. The video link will be in the description below. Behind that is this thing here, which is called the coolant pump housing, and it's where this black pipe feeds up from the thermostat housing into the back of the pump. If you have leaks from in here, this is going to be a bit of a nightmare for you. It's a lot of effort to get access to this. I'll go through this as quite a procedure, and I'll do that at the end of this video. It requires the engine mount, the vibration damper, and a whole bunch of stuff to come off here. You'll need to make a special tool to pull this out, and I'll show you how to do all that. But it's a lot of effort to get this thing off if you've got leaks from up inside here. To remove this thing here, which is what's called the cooling socket, which runs down the right-hand side of the engine, it connects to the pipe that goes along the top of the engine, which connects the top of the block, the outlets for the coolant to come out of it. There's a seal on the underside here. This might be leaking. It might be the reason why that needs to be removed, or this rotary valve here. It's leaking, or maybe it's broken, and therefore it needs to be replaced. This is pretty simple to remove. Obviously the pipes and everything need to be removed from the bottom here. The valve here, this will need to be removed first. It would be nice if it was just this seal here that you're replacing, that you didn't have to remove this, but unfortunately that screw hole there is behind it. So this one here needs to come off first. There's a couple of screws that are in underneath here that need to come out. And the problem with this is this O-ring here is going to be really jammed on there. This is quite a fine fit with that plastic inside the housing. And if you get this off center at all, it'll snap off the top of this here, which is what I found happened. And then you'll have to replace this thing. It's not too expensive in the US. It's about 50 bucks or so, which isn't so bad for a Porsche part. And then once that comes off, then you can remove the screw there. There's a couple of Christmas tree plugs. There's one here for the electrical wire that goes down to the the engine oil pressure regulator in there, and the one here is there's a bleeder line, coolant bleeder line that's pressed into there. So you just need to pull those off. So once that's removed, then you'll go up to the top of the engine. You'll be these three screws here. These are M8. This one's M6. There'll be a bracket that sits over the top of here, which holds onto the solenoid, which is the one that actually goes to that there. So just push that off to the side, and then once all that's removed, this thing will just pop straight off really easily, and you can remove it from below. Torques for these ones at the top here, they're M8, they take 33 Newton meters. There's the little M6 one there that takes 13 Newton meters, and the T30 torques that go into there that hold onto the valve, they take 10 Newton meters. So how does this thing work? There's a bellows on the side here, an arm that goes to a big rotary valve inside here, and the coolant would be either allowed to or not allowed to go through there. You can see that's open at the moment. So with that spring in there, that's sitting over the top of it and obviously in place. It's going to push it to the open position all the time, and when vacuum is applied, that's going to pull it this way, so that arm is going to get pulled that way, which closes everything off. So you can see. There we go. From the underside, that is the rotary valve, and that's that large outlet that goes to the radiators. The connections that are pressed into just with Christmas tree plugs, so this electrical line here. And there's the vacuum line up the top here as well that needs to be pulled out as well. That screw that connects the cooling socket to the block there is just there. And when we're trying to remove this is what I would suggest. Instead of just trying to pull it down, is once you remove those two screws that are up in there, is to wiggle it back and forth like that and try and pull straight down to get that out. Now obviously that's come out easily now because I've just re-greased it and put it in there, but that will be very, very stuck in there. At the top we've got those three connection points there. The line that we want to disconnect that goes down to the bellows is that one there, so we can just pull that one off, and that little bracket is bolted on as part of that right-hand bolt there, which holds on to the solenoid. I would suggest starting at the bottom, removing the valve down there first, and then coming up to the top, removing these and all these disconnection points, and then going down and removing that last bolt that's connected to the cooling socket, and then removing the whole thing from below. For the hard pipes and connections that go up to the radiators, the way this works, this is the line that goes to the radiators. This is the return. It does a swap over, so the one that's going to the radiators, this one on the right-hand side, and the one on the left is the return. The return coolant temperature sensor, so the outlet from the radiators is just there. That's very easy just to disconnect and then just unscrew that and put in a new one if required. The pipes then come around, they do a right angle here, and then there's a rubber connection, which is exactly the same type of connections as these one here. So there's one like that and one like that. So they're very, very easy to remove. And then you've got the hard pipes that run up to the front, and then there are connections again like this that run into the radiator, which are very, very easy to remove. To remove the hard pipes here is very, very simple. All we need to do is remove these and this bracket here, which is the thing that supports the fuel tank. So if you're going to remove this, I would suggest having quite a low fuel level in the car. It'll sit there quite happily, but it just stops like lots of weight being put down on it. In addition to that, I would suggest that you make sure you have these connections here because this is what's going to be supporting the pipe when you actually remove all this stuff. So it's just that connection there, which is the rubber pipe there. There is a bracket in here, just the little plastic clips like the one back here, which we removed before. So that's all that's supporting it. In addition to that, there is a bleeder line that runs along the top of the left-hand pipe, which you'll need to unclip, and there's a number of clips all the way along that if you needed to do that. These brackets here, easy enough to remove. They take 65 Newton meters on install. And that's just sitting there now because it's just sitting on that clip there. So you just pull that off, including the bleeder line at the top. So that's what that looks like. And to remove the one underneath the fuel tank, there are 8 connection points. There are 2 M6 screws there, so 10mm sockets that come off. They are just supporting the hard pipes. And then there are 6 connection points for the bracket itself to the chassis. On there, in these holes here, there are 2 bolts, and up the front here, there are 2 straps, metal straps that sit underneath the fuel tank. This is just a protector. The fuel tank's just in there. And so what's going to happen is when we remove all those connection points, this thing will just rotate down this way, and it's hanging on those straps down here, which makes it pretty simple to remove. And then you can just lift off those straps. And now with those brackets removed, that thing's just wobbling about because there's nothing supported apart from the hoses front and back. Down there you can see along the top here there's that bleeder line, so that would need to be unclipped. There's only that on the left-hand pipe, so you do that all the way along. And then I'm not going to disconnect it because I've done it before. It comes out very, very simply, but those same connection points there. Be aware that there's going to be a bunch of coolant in here, so it's what I found just rotating it like that, so the coolant sort of pulls in here, and then just hold that pipe when you pull it out of front and rear, and then just go and plonk it in your bucket. The only thing that's a little bit different on the right-hand pipe, this is the one that goes to the heater core. So that's just got one of those clamps, and again, you just disconnect that, and that right-hand pipe will come out quite happily. And if you need to remove one of these pipes here, like I talked about before, you can see there's no gap there, so you would need to drop this subframe down, support all of that. So after you've disconnected all of this and the one up the front next to the radiators, then that will come out. This is inside the front wheel well on the right-hand side, and it's pretty much exactly the same for both. The way this works, we've got the hard line, which is coming from that large pipe. It goes into a plastic piece here. It's a bit difficult to see behind this pipe at the front, but it is joined, so that bit there and that pipe there are part of the same pipe. And the other side of that joiner, so it's sort of a T-piece, there's a rubber connection, which is kind of like this, except it's got 2 of those spring clamps on it, so 1 on each end, and that joins a pipe that goes to the other side. This one here is the pipe from the other side, so on the other side, the pipe, which is the return, has another one of those connectors, so it's kind of the mirror image of this. I'm not sure if you can tell here, but the only way you would get access to these is to drop the subframe. There's no way you're going to get access to that. So I'm not going to pull the whole subframe down to show you, but it's pretty obvious once you get in here. The hoses that go from the hard pipes to the radiator, so you got the top one here, it runs along the top, it's clipped into a clip there, and then it's just got one of those spring clamps there. So that's exactly the same as what's at the back. The one at the bottom runs in underneath here, and they've put a nice little gap in here, so that gives you access to that spring clamp, which is exactly the same as the one there, to remove that hose if required. If you've got a leak from behind here, this housing, which is the back of the coolant pump, needs to come out, and it's a complete pain, to be perfectly honest. If the leak's from in here, you can get access to this quite happily without removing it, but to get this off, whole bunch of stuff comes on. I'll go through that in a moment. You'll need to take the vibration damper off. So have a look at the video that I've made on how to do that. And then once all that is off, plus a bunch of stuff at the top, then this thing can get pulled off. And because the way the seals are, there's O-rings, there's a couple of O-rings and a pipe there, and a big one that it pushes into the bottom of the block there. Those two O-rings stick so hard to the metal, it'll actually tear them apart and rip bits off, which I'll have to clean up on the way out. So it's not going to do this, because I've obviously pulled this off before, re-greased everything, replaced the seals, etc., or just push straight back on as easily as this. You'll need a tool, and I'll show you how that tool works. And what it's going to do is bolt onto some spots here which bolt into the block, and then also bolt another piece of metal which bolts onto a couple of bits here that's threaded into the housing, and we pull the housing off via that, but I'll show you that in a moment. So to explain all the connection points that are connected to the pump housing so we can remove it. From the underside, we'll have disconnected this pipe here, which is one that's bolted there. There's a seal inside that there. Also remove the tensioner. So there's two bolts that come out to remove that. We'll have the pump. There'll be a bracket that sits on the lower two connection points here, which connects to another pipe which holds the thermostat housing in place. So you'll need to remove those, as well as all the bolts around the outside of them. The pump will come off. And then once we get to that, you'll have a setup that kind of looks like this. The mount goes into there, so it's that point there and that one there, and they get screwed into the block. And the vibration damper is going to be sitting under it in there somewhere, and it overlaps the housing, so the vibration damper needs to come out. But when you remove the mount from the underside, then you'll have the vibration damper looking like that. The vibration damper will need to be removed. And the pump itself is much easier to remove once you remove the housing and also the mount. You just get a lot more room, so I would probably do the pump as one of the last things. And then the bolts that are actually holding this on, everything from the bottom has been now taken off, but at the top here you've got a screw there, and this one here needs to come out because that's where that spacer is on the top there, and the mount sits on top of that, and that's the bit that allows you to change the drive belt. So that one needs to come out. That takes 65 Newton meters. These are M8, so they take 33 Newton meters, and this one's M6 that takes 13 Newton meters. And then once all of that comes out, then the only thing that's holding this in place are the bits that are actually shoved on the other side here. So that's jammed into the block, and that one's jammed into a pipe. This one's not so bad, but this one's really jammed in there so hard, you're not going to be able to pull it out by hand. The way the tool is set up that I'm going to use to draw this out, because there are spots here and here, even though this is the one where the mount is connected, I think this bottom one here maybe is for the 911 plate on the back of the car, because this is all the same part, but there's a threaded M10 into the block on the other side. So I'm going to use this one here because I want it centered around this one as much as possible, and there's an M8 here where that can slide through, and then that is going to sit there like that, where that threads through into the block. So this is being held in place, and each of those is going to sit on a nut, and we adjust the height of that, so this is sitting nice and evenly. And what's important here is that one there, making sure the distance between the nut there and there is about 15 millimeters, so you've got room to pull this thing out. And then from there, there's going to be another piece that sits over the top of this, because there are threaded parts of the pump assembly here on the housing that I can thread into this. There's an M8 here and an M6 there. So that one there's got the M8, and each of these has got a nut on the top of it like that. So they thread through into the housing. And here's my M6 again. It's got a nut. I'll give you the dimensions in a moment of what this tool actually needs to be. So we thread each of these well into the to the housing, because this is what it's going to pull up on the M8 here and the M6 there. And then what we do with this staying stable, then we hold onto the ends here and tighten down these nuts. And we do that a bit at a time, so it draws the pump up evenly around the spot here where it's being held in. And eventually that will just pull that up and out of the block. So like I said earlier, gap there, about 15 millimeters or so. I think it's probably going to move about 12 to actually get the thing out. But what you'll notice as I draw this thing out is that this gap here will start to move out this way. If there's excessive force when you're doing this, then stop what you're doing. Check that you've got all these screws and everything removed from up the top here. And especially towards the end here, if there's a lot of force, because it should get easier as you go, if it's pressing against this. I'm not sure if you can see in here, but those O-rings were jammed in there and stuck so well, it's actually left a ring of black rubber from the O-ring in there, which is why it's so hard to pull the damn thing out. And on this one here, the hole that was in the housing, there was again another black ring of rubber that came off the O-ring. So make sure you clean it up on this one and also on the housing prior to install, and replace those seals before you put it back in. What's really interesting with these pipes that have the two O-rings, the one that's closest to the pressure, you can see it on that one there and also that one there, and it was on the others as well, is the one that sticks to it. So obviously the heat and everything maybe damages it or something, or makes it stick really hard. The second one never does, but obviously you need to clean that up and replace that prior to installing. And to clean up all the rubber on these pipes, because they need to be perfectly clean, I just fashioned a small piece of plastic with a flat edge in there, bit of 320 grit sandpaper, and then that seems to take it off quite nicely. And on the inside of the holes, I've just got in there with my paper. I mean, it's not going to take any metal off at all. There's so little pressure, but that takes that rubber off quite nicely. Now there might be a little bit of staining, but just rub your fingers on the inside there to check that you can feel no rubber. That's going to maybe create some sort of a leak later. To remove this pipe along the top here is a lot of work, to be perfectly honest. There's a seal in behind here and also another one in behind the back of this one here. So if you get leaks that are running down the front here, it might be that seal. Unfortunately, this pipe has a lot of stuff bolted to it. I've removed a lot of the stuff, and I'll explain to you what needs to happen to get access to this thing so you can get it off. The first thing is the alternator needs to be removed from in here. So you'll obviously have to get access to the top. The center portion of the intake manifold will need to be removed. There's a deflection roller, which is this one here that sits there. It has 3 bolts that go into it, the 2 that go in here, and also the one that goes in the back here. And to be honest, this one at the back here is the hardest of everything here to get access to, and I'll explain a bit more of that in a moment. But that needs to be removed. The air conditioning compressor, you need to loosen it and lift it up like I've done there. That would normally be sitting down here, and then that allows this thing to come out. The cooling socket, which is this one here, would have to be removed. It's connected over the top here, so it bolts over the top of this one and holds this in place. And then finally, once all this stuff is removed off the top, you'll have to go in from underneath, and the coolant pump housing, which is this one here, it straps over the top of this one here. So this, it doesn't need to be removed. So this whole thing needs to be loosened, which means the mount needs to come off You don't need to remove the vibration damper, which is sitting here. The housing sits underneath it here, but there's enough looseness in it. And once you remove all of these bolts here that hold this thing to the block, then this thing will just wiggle about because it's just stuck in with the seals that go into the block at the bottom. And then you can move that out enough so that allows you to remove the screws on this. So the screws that hold this in place, there's one there, there's another one in there, plus the few on the other side that held the cooling socket on. And then once all of those are removed, then this thing can be popped off and moved up and out of the way, because you can move this thing out about maybe a centimetre or so, which allows that thing to come out, replace the seals, clean everything up, and then replace that again. All of the bolts here, if they are an M8, they're 33 Newton meters, and if they are an M6, they're 13 Newton meters. The only difference here are the two for the deflection roller here. They're M8 at the front. They're a class 8.8 bolts, so they only get 23 Newton meters, vice 33. And you can tell the difference. Look at the end of the bolt. If it's got 8.8 on it, then it gets the lower torque. So that's 23, and if it's a 10.9, then it gets the higher torque, 33. The one at the back here, the M6, is a 10.9, so it gets 13 Newton meters. Things that I've done in here to get everything out of the way so we can get access to that pipe that runs along the top here. Obviously the alternator has been removed. Resources for all of these procedures that I've done before, I'll just put links in the description below. But obviously the alternator has been removed. The deflection roller, that rear screw, that is the hardest thing here, and I'll explain to you why in a moment. And that's probably the thing you want to do last, because getting that out, but especially getting it back in, I drop that and it'll find its way down into one of these nooks down here, and you'll be dismantling half the engine to try and get that out again. So just be a bit careful with that. You might just have to remove a few things. So things that I did remove, the air oil separator pipe that runs all the way along the top here, I removed that out of the way. And the reason for that is that to get access to this, everything's sort of sitting over the top of it, including the air oil separator pipe, as well as the cable that runs to the starter motor, etc. So the way this cable sits, we've got the connection back here to the starter. We've got the connection points here, which is that joint where everything comes to from the battery. So that cable comes from the battery at the front, that connects in there, plus the two screw connections there that connect to a cable, that connect to a bracket that sits on top of the air conditioning condenser. So you want to disconnect all of that. This one here runs over to the alternator. And this thing here, and the bit that's sitting just here, that's covering everything up, because it's going to be right down here where you're trying to find your way and you're trying to pull this out of the way, and there's basically so little room. There's a tab that sticks out of the side of the connection point, which is the oil fill port down here. And it just sits onto this tab here. So all you do is you just grab hold of that and wiggle it, and it'll click off. It takes a good bit of force, but it'll eventually come off. And then you can just get that out of the way, and then you can get a lot better access to this. In addition to that, so the air conditioning condenser, like I've done here, the center portion of the intake manifold will have to come out. There are three connections. There's the one there, one there, and one there. Again, resources for how to remove all this stuff is in the description below. In addition to that, there is a bracket over here that connects onto that holds the air conditioning pipes. There's a little hex. You pull that out and that thing just opens straight up, and you can disconnect, and that actually gives you a lot more flexibility with the hoses to move everything around. And with the air conditioning condenser, just to hold that up out of the way, I've just put a 6mm screw in there, put a strap around and held it up from the back here, so that's out of the way, so I get access to the pipe down here easily, and the thing will come off. With the housing installed, with all the bolts removed, you can see they can quite happily move. And it was like this even when it was really tight and I couldn't actually pull the thing out by hand, because it's just sitting on the seals down the bottom here. But that's the thing that allows you to move that away from the pipe at the top here, so you can pop that off without needing to remove the pump housing.